Hello and welcome to History 211, U.S. History to 1865. I am your professor for the course, Dr. Aubrey Underwood. As mentioned previously, I am Associate Professor of History in the Department of African American Studies, Africana Women's Studies, and History. And I just want to spend just a few moments with you today telling you about the approach to the class and what the class will cover and really what the class is about. Our class is just a one semester survey exploring the foundations of American history before the Civil War, leading up to the Civil War. We begin with Indigenous history, and we also explore the genesis and arrival of those who are enslaved from Africa, the development of race-based and plantation slavery in the American South, um, while also looking at the wars that are fought over slavery and rebellions. We spend a lot of time in this course talking about rebellions because they stand out in terms of being quite plentiful, both rebellions that are led by those who are enslaved, rebellions that are led by um, indigenous peoples, rebellions that are led by colonists, rebellions that are led by workers against owners in factories. There are so many rebellions, and this is one of the ongoing themes that we will discuss throughout our class. Another theme that we are going to discuss is the idea of progress. And there is a notion in American history that everything just sort of happened the way it was supposed to happen. And none of that is true. We should even question the idea as if things get better over time. There is a essential Enlightenment belief that becomes very popular in this time period that has continued, and that is things improve over time. We should really, particularly in our current moment, challenge this assumption. My historical approach is to unpack the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is somehow different or extraordinary because of its development. We're going to deconstruct that idea in this class. We do not believe in American exceptionalism. Rather, we are going to look at the forces shaping America and really understand how conflict, class conflict, racial conflict, gender conflict is a central theme in American history. So when we find ourselves in the 21st century, in the midst of a pandemic, looking around at American promises that remain unfulfilled, American infrastructure that is collapsing, American freedoms that are getting taken away, um, we can look around at history and see how these ideas are first created, built, and how they remain unfulfilled. And that's really the value of history, particularly at this moment. Um, so, as we talk about the arrival of both Europeans as well as Africans, it's important to note just again the rich 1,000-year history of indigenous people, those who were already here prior to Western arrival. And if you just briefly take a look at this map, what you're going to see is a North America as well as Mexico, including Canada, that is populated with peoples, right? These are different familial clans, if you will, nations of people, some who are in very complex relationships with others, some that are more distant and remote. But there is a vast collection of peoples who are already here, who have their own ideas about religion, who are very familiar with how to grow food and sustain human life and have their own social ideas. And again, very complex ideas at that. So when we see this rich arrival, particularly the arrival in Virginia right here along the Atlantic seaboard, this is going to have a highly disruptive effect. And think about the other central theme of this course, which is white westward expansion, right? So as colonists are going to first emerge and land around here, and remember, this part of the world will already be under the process of colonization by the Spanish. The French are colonizing as well. So when the British arrive, they're not the first Europeans by far in North America. There are Europeans all over. What they are doing are establishing what will be colonies. This sort of idea of claiming land somewhere else in order to benefit a motherland in a different place. They are going to disrupt what had already been here. But again, they're not going to be the only ones, right? Europeans are coming from all over different nation states of Western Europe. Another theme that we talked about, or rather that we will talk about in this class, is what is known as the Great Transformation, where we see the first few generations of enslaved Africans who are able to buy their freedom, who are able to become free people. Even some become slave owners themselves, and how that starts to change by the 19th century. So by the 19th century, these mechanisms that really had allowed for enslaved peoples to become free are no longer allowed, and they become even more stringent with the creation of what will be the United States. Another theme that we will discuss is then the history of free people in the United States. Interestingly, there will be more free people emerging, Black communities in the South beginning in 1800. So for a generation and a half leading up to Civil War, there are increasing numbers of those who are free. Now, that's hard to make sense of, considering that the laws are becoming stricter. Oppression is becoming even harder. So this is something to unpack. And again, it's why we are able to do this at Clark Atlanta University. Really look at how we see free communities developing even before the Civil War. One example being right outside of Augusta, where we'll also see the emergence of Morehouse College, right? So the original Morehouse College comes out of a free community right outside of Augusta, Georgia. And we will also in our course really think about that juicy connective tissue between education, religion, and Black freedom through the expression of abolition. So those things are very much interrelated in our narrative. We're going to look at religion, both in terms of religion and the ways that it creates chaos and disorder, as in the case of the practice of Puritanism. And as I mentioned just previously, the way that religion also is used as a tool of liberation, as both exist, right? They are not mutually exclusive. Referring back to my original statement, this time period that we look at, roughly 1600 to 1860, is just filled with rebellions, all types of rebellions. For instance, and we'll look at these in more specificity across the class, but Bacon's Rebellion, which is a British colonist who is upset that indigenous people have better land. He starts basically a class and racial war in Virginia in order to get what he thought is deserving. And out of that has very severe racial consequences. There's the New York Slave Revolt that happens in 1712 as slavery is legal across these British colonies. The Stono Rebellion, right? The very large slave revolt that happens in South Carolina. There's Shays' Rebellion that we will talk about that occurs right after the American Revolution. So in just the immediate years of the U.S. becoming a new country, veterans, led by a veteran officer, Daniel Shay, who did not get paid what they were supposed to get paid. They tried to create a rebellion against the new government. It does not work. It is not successful. There's Prosser's Rebellion, Denmark Vesey's rebellion, and of course Turner's rebellion, some of which I remember a number of students referencing in your introduction discussions. Uh, Nowhere near a completed list of rebellions, but just to give you an idea of just how plentiful rebellions are. We're going to look at also, oftentimes erroneously, we look at the Civil War as the war over slavery, but it's not the only one. The United States goes to war several times in order to expand slavery before the Civil War, which should only also embolden us to know that the Civil War is most undoubtedly about enslaving people and making sure that remains a part of Southern economics, political, and cultural life. But that's not the only one. It's preceded by a couple of others, and we're going to talk about that in our class. I am an environmental historian by trade who looks at again, the very interconnected tissue between the environment, race, class, and gender. And there are climatic changes that happen during this period. There are ecological and environmental changes that are happening. With plantation agriculture, it also will create other ecological problems in the American South. Westward expansion creates ecological problems. And of course, first and foremost, it's where you're going to get your water. Is your water contaminated? Is your water going to make your people sick? As it does across history. So we will make sure that we are also discussing ideas about the environment and what we see in this time period, because massive change is coming that is brought with industrialization. But even before those sorts of ecological problems are happening, with the arrival of Europeans in North America, right? What are they coming for? They're coming for resources. The Spanish are looking for gold right here, but they'll take what they can. The French are going to colonize up and down, right? The Mississippi River. What are they looking for? They're looking for beaver, foxes, other animals to make into clothes that they can sell back in Europe. What are they looking for? They're looking for things to make, things for sale. In this part of the world, it's going to be the cultivation of tobacco that is going to start creating private fortunes, of which are really unknown in the early modern period outside of nations and religions, right? That's the key for capitalism. It's private, it belongs to oneself, not to another institution. So all of these things are very interconnected. Um, and speaking of, let's very briefly just talk about Pocahontas. So this week, you or by tomorrow, will need to answer these particular questions about her life. And again, when you think about Pocahontas, this young woman who is witnessing not only the arrival of British colonists, but the massive changes that will happen within her own lifetime, you can also start to really have what we call historical empathy, or the ability to connect with people who have lived in different historical eras. And her life before the arrival of the British, right, was very typical of other Indigenous women. But as an Indigenous woman, she is also selected in many ways to be these guides for the colonists. So women are often used as what we would consider emissaries, or the ones who are able to connect connect people who don't know each other. And perhaps there are biological reasons that you might identify as to why women are able to do this. And often children become the product of that, right? And if you have a child with someone, you are bringing this sort of bigger alliance together. So women will often be used or asked to really be guides, emissaries, the connection between sort of colonists and Indigenous people. This is an image that is painted of Pocahontas after 1616, and obviously she would not have looked like this before, right? She is in this way depicted at 21, um, in these very British um, way in terms of portraiture, in terms of what she's wearing, and I would also pay attention to her skin tone. She looks white. Is Pocahontas white? No, she's absolutely not white. And yet she is depicted in this way um, by British artists, which will also have an impact as to how we think about her, right? So, as a young woman, she will marry a British man, John Smith. She will eventually live part of her life in England, where she was known to be very unhappy. And you can also sort of consider, right, how the freedom she has in terms to explore her world is very much gone in England. You cannot walk around by yourself. It is not allowed for women to do this. The clothes she wears are oh so different and constricting. Before, as a young woman in Virginia, she wouldn't have had to wear clothes. She would have had sort of so much more freedom um, for self expression, to make decisions, to even physically roam the world in ways that this woman will not have, right? So we can also think about the ways that, where you live and your environment shapes the abilities that women have. Um, I could think you can also think about what then it means for this type of physical constriction for women, what that's going to mean for Indigenous women across um, the United States. But one of the interesting things that happens in terms of literature is we will see something called the captivity narrative emerge very early on in colonial history. And the captivity narrative basically is about white women who get stolen or kidnapped by indigenous men. They sometimes are brought back, sometimes not, but yet have a profound change, right, as they experience and see a new world. And there are just so many of these accounts that come out during this part of our history. That the idea of the frontier, right, living in a unsettled world becomes a part of the American identity, that Americans are rugged, that Americans are going to be sort of hardened, aware. Of course, whether or not that is true is certainly debatable. But these are some of the ideas that come out of this very early colonial literature, often written about white women's experiences as they are taken, kidnapped, or become a part, rather, of indigenous world. I bring this up again to remind us, right, when it is then the indigenous woman's perspective of entering the white world, the idea that she wouldn't want to be a part of that is sort of overwhelmingly shocking. The idea for at least white audiences. So white audiences will very much accept Pocahontas, but it depict her as a British woman, right? Not as a indigenous woman, which also sort of says a lot about how they see her as well as gender. So think about this as you are writing very brief responses to this. This is just a first assignment to make sure you're keeping up, reading, posting in these links. Please let me know if you have any questions, issues, or concerns as we move along in the class. Thank you.